They mocked her youth in a D.C. courtroom, dismissing Karoline Leavitt as just a press secretary out of her league. The judge smirked. The prosecutor sneered, but she stood calm, clutching a worn notebook. Nobody knew it held her law school thesis, crafted under a Supreme Court justice's mentorship. Why would someone so young face a legal storm without flinching? Before we dive into today's story, if you find this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming stories. You're also welcome to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Every piece of feedback is truly valuable in helping Crossfire Justice improve. Thank you so much for always being with us. And now, let's jump into this thrilling and unexpected story together. The Washington, D.C. courthouse stood like a gray monument under the October sky, its marble steps worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Inside courtroom 3B, the air was thick with murmurs and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Karoline Leavitt, barely 30, stood at the defendant's table, her navy blazer slightly creased from the long morning. She was the youngest White House press secretary in history, a fact that seemed to amuse the room more than impress it. Her blonde hair was pulled back neatly, and her hands rested on a small, worn notebook, its leather cover frayed at the edges. The judge, a man named Harold Grayson with silver hair and a voice like gravel, leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he scanned her. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "This isn't a press conference. Save your charm for the cameras." A ripple of laughter spread through the gallery, where reporters and onlookers sat with notepads and skeptical expressions. The prosecutor, a wiry man named Daniel Kessler, smirked and adjusted his tie before launching into his opening statement. "Your Honor, Miss Leavitt has violated the Hatch Act with reckless political statements about Canada's tax policies, using her position to bolster the president's agenda," he said, his voice sharp and practiced. He paced in front of the bench, glancing at Karoline as if she were a child caught misbehaving. "She's out of her depth, and this court will prove it." Karoline's face remained still, but her fingers tightened around the notebook, the leather cool against her skin. She felt the weight of every eye in the room, some curious, most dismissive. If you've ever stood in a place where no one expects you to belong, you'd know that sting. It wasn't just the words, it was the assumption behind them. The certainty that she was too young, too inexperienced, too much of a figurehead to matter. Her heart beat steadily, though, and her hazel eyes stayed fixed on the judge, not in defiance but in quiet resolve. She'd faced rooms like this before, press briefings where reporters fired questions like bullets, meetings where older aides raised eyebrows at her title. But this was different. This was a courtroom, and the stakes weren't just her reputation but the truth itself. The gallery whispered, their voices a low hum that seemed to press against her. A woman in the third row, a journalist with a green scarf and a notepad, scribbled furiously. Her lips pursed. Karoline noticed her but didn't linger. She let Kessler's accusations wash over her, each one a stone dropped into a still pond. He called her careless, manipulative, a pawn of the president. The judge nodded slightly, his pen tapping the bench as if he'd already made up his mind. She wanted to speak, to interrupt, to lay out the facts right then, but something held her back, a lesson from years ago, from a mentor who'd taught her that timing was everything. Her thumb brushed the notebook's spine, a small gesture that grounded her. That notebook wasn't just paper and ink, it was a piece of her past, a tether to someone who'd believed in her when no one else had. The judge's smirk widened as Kessler sat down, and he leaned back, addressing her directly. "I hope you've got more than talking points, young lady," he said, the words landing like a slap. The laughter came again, louder this time, and Karoline felt a flicker of heat in her chest. Not anger. Not yet, just the slow burn of being underestimated. She stood a little straighter, her shoulders squared. The journalist in the green scarf stopped writing and looked up, her eyes narrowing as if she'd caught something no one else had. Karoline's silence wasn't surrender. It was the calm before a storm no one saw coming. What was in that notebook? And why hadn't she opened it yet? The courtroom in Washington, D.C. felt smaller now, its high ceilings and polished wood panels closing in as the prosecutor's voice echoed. Karoline Leavitt sat at the defendant's table, her hands resting on the worn leather notebook that seemed out of place among the sleek binders and tablets around her. The prosecutor, Daniel Kessler, paced with theatrical confidence, his words sharp as he painted her as a reckless opportunist. Miss Leavitt's statements on Canada's tax policies weren't just careless, they were a deliberate attempt to manipulate public opinion for political gain, he said, turning to the gallery for effect. The crowd leaned forward, some nodding, their faces a mix of curiosity and judgment. Karoline's hazel eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly on a young clerk at the side, a woman with tightly braided hair who scribbled notes with mechanical precision. The clerk's expression was unreadable, her pen moving as if detached from the drama unfolding. Karoline's fingers traced the frayed edges of her notebook, a quiet gesture that steadied her. That notebook wasn't just a tool, it was a relic of her past, filled with handwritten notes from late-night study sessions at Georgetown Law, where she'd been the youngest in her class. It held quotes from her mentor, Professor Ellen Whitaker, a legal scholar who'd seen something in Karoline when others saw only a small-town girl with big dreams. The memory of Ellen's voice, calm, unwavering, kept her grounded now. "Don't rush to speak," Ellen had said. "Let them underestimate you. Then show them who you are." Karoline's chest tightened, not with fear but with the weight of carrying that lesson into this moment. If you've ever felt the world's already made up its mind about you, you'd know why she stayed silent. The judge, Harold Grayson, leaned back in his chair, his silver hair catching the light as he rolled his eyes. "Miss Leavitt, do you have anything to add? Or are we wasting our time?" he asked, his tone sharp enough to draw a chuckle from the gallery. She opened her mouth to respond, but Kessler cut in, his voice rising. "Your Honor, this is a clear violation of the Hatch Act." She used her position to push a narrative, plain and simple. The accusation landed like a stone, and the murmurs in the room grew louder. Karoline's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. She'd faced worse press rooms where reporters dismissed her as a figurehead, political operatives who called her a token. But here, in this courtroom, the stakes were higher. Her career, her integrity, the truth itself hung in the balance. She glanced at the clerk again, noticing the woman's pen pause for a moment, her eyes flickering toward Karoline. Was it curiosity, doubt? Karoline couldn't tell. But it was enough to remind her she wasn't invisible. Someone was watching. Even if they didn't speak, the judge tapped his gavel lightly, silencing the room. "Miss Leavitt, if you're planning to respond, I suggest you do it soon. This isn't a debate club," he said, his words laced with mockery. The gallery laughed again, the sound grating against her skin. Karoline's fingers pressed harder against the notebook, her thumb finding a small tear in the leather. She thought of her father, a high school history teacher who'd driven her to mock trial competitions in their old pickup truck, telling her stories of justice prevailing against the odds. "You don't need to shout to be heard," he'd said. "You just need to be right." That memory anchored her now, keeping her from rising to the bait. She nodded at the judge, her voice soft but clear. "I'll wait for my turn, Your Honor." The simplicity of her words seemed to catch him off guard, his smirk faltering for a split second. The prosecutor resumed his attack, pulling up a screenshot of Karoline's post on X. projecting it onto a screen for the room to see. "This is evidence of her overreach," he said, pointing to her words about Canada's tax policy. The crowd whispered, some shaking their heads. Karoline's eyes stayed on the screen, her mind racing through the legal arguments she'd prepared. She could have stood then, could have challenged the framing, but she didn't. Not yet. Timing was everything. And this wasn't her moment. The clerk's pen moved again, but slower now, as if she were listening more than writing. Karoline's heart beat steadily, a quiet rhythm against the storm of accusations. She wasn't here to argue for the sake of arguing. She was here to protect something bigger, a truth no one in this room expected her to carry. That notebook, with its faded pages and careful notes, was more than a keepsake. It was her weapon, waiting for the right moment to be drawn. What was she holding back? And why was she so sure it would matter? The Washington, D.C. courtroom was a theater of murmurs and sidelong glances, its heavy wooden benches creaking under the weight of an attentive gallery. Karoline Leavitt stood at the defendant's table, her navy blazer a stark contrast to the polished oak around her. Her hands rested lightly on her worn leather notebook, its frayed edges a quiet rebellion against the sterile precision of the room. The prosecutor, Daniel Kessler, was in full stride now, his voice rising like a storm. Miss Leavitt abused her role to shield the president, pushing a divisive agenda with no regard for the law, he declared, his eyes glinting as he faced the judge. "She's out of her depth, Your Honor, and her actions prove it." The words were meant to cut, and they did, each one landing like a jab in a boxing ring. The gallery stirred, some spectators nodding, others whispering to their neighbors. Karoline's breath was slow, deliberate, her hazel eyes fixed on a spot just beyond Kessler's shoulder. She felt the familiar ache of being underestimated, a sensation she'd carried since her first press briefing, when reporters dismissed her as a token hire. Judge Harold Grayson leaned forward, his silver hair catching the courtroom's harsh light. "I hope you've got more than talking points, Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice thick with sarcasm. The gallery erupted in laughter, the sound sharp and grating, like glass underfoot. Karoline's fingers brushed the notebook's spine, the leather cool against her skin. It was her anchor, a tether to the late-night study sessions with Professor Ellen Whitaker, who'd taught her to face rooms like this with grace under fire. The accusations kept coming, each one heavier than the last. Kessler projected another screenshot of her ex-post, a single sentence about Canada's tax policy, twisting it into evidence of corruption. "This is no innocent comment," he said, pointing at the screen. "This is a calculated move to sway voters, a violation of the Hatch Act." The crowd murmured, some shaking their heads, their faces a mix of disbelief and disdain. Karoline's chest tightened, not with fear but with the weight of their assumptions. If you've ever been judged before you could explain, you'd know that quiet burn. She wanted to stand, to counter each point with the precision she'd honed in law school. But she held back. Ellen's voice echoed in her mind. "Let them dig their own grave before you hand them the shovel." Her gaze drifted to the gallery, where a woman in a green scarf, a journalist with a notepad, sat in the third row. The journalist's brow was furrowed, her pen hovering over the page as if she'd sensed something wasn't right. Karoline noticed her, a flicker of hope in the sea of skeptical faces. The clerk, a young woman with tightly braided hair, stood near the judge's bench, her expression still unreadable but her movements slower, more deliberate. The tension in the room was suffocating, the air heavy with the expectation that Karoline would falter. Kessler turned to her, his smile predatory. "Do you deny these charges, Miss Leavitt? Or are you just here to waste our time?" The question was a trap, designed to provoke a stumble. The judge raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to crack. Karoline's fingers tightened on the notebook, her thumb finding the familiar tear in the leather. She thought of her father, who'd spent his life teaching history to high school kids, telling her that truth was stronger than any argument. "Don't let them rush you," he'd said. "The right moment will come." She stood, her voice soft but steady. "Your Honor, I'd like to respond when the prosecution rests," she said, her words simple but firm. The judge blinked, caught off guard by her composure. Kessler scoffed, turning to the gallery as if to rally their support. "She's stalling," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. The laughter came again, but it was thinner now, less certain. The journalist in the green scarf leaned forward, her pen still, her eyes locked on Karoline. The clerk's gaze flickered toward her too, a subtle shift that didn't go unnoticed. Karoline sat back down, her heart pounding but her face calm. She wasn't breaking, not today, not ever. The room was a pressure cooker, and she could feel the weight of every stare. But something was shifting. Someone was watching, and they knew this wasn't right. What was she holding back, and when would she let it out? The Washington, D.C. courtroom held its breath, the hum of fluorescent lights barely audible over the rustle of papers and shifting feet. Karoline Leavitt stood at the defendant's table, her navy blazer slightly rumpled but her posture unwavering. Her worn leather notebook lay open before her, its pages yellowed and filled with precise handwriting that seemed to belong to another time. The gallery, a mix of reporters, lawyers, and curious onlookers, watched with a mix of skepticism and intrigue. The prosecutor, Daniel Kessler, had just finished another round of accusations, his voice sharp as he branded Karoline a political pawn who'd overstepped her role with reckless posts on X. Judge Harold Grayson, his silver hair glinting under the courtroom's harsh light, leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of impatience. "Miss Leavitt, we're waiting," he said, his tone heavy with the expectation that she'd falter. The laughter from earlier had faded, but the air still carried the weight of doubt. Karoline's hazel eyes flicked to the judge, then to the gallery, where a journalist in a green scarf sat with her notepad poised, her expression intense. The young clerk with tightly braided hair stood near the bench, her hands clasped, her gaze flickering between Karoline and the judge. Karoline took a slow breath, her fingers brushing the notebook's frayed spine. It wasn't just a keepsake, it was her law school thesis, a meticulous study of the Hatch Act's limitations in the digital age, written under the guidance of Professor Ellen Whitaker. The memory of Ellen's quiet confidence steadied her now, a reminder that truth didn't need to shout. "Your Honor, may I address the court?" she asked, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the room's tension like a blade. The judge sighed, his eyes narrowing, but he nodded. "Make it quick," he said, his words clipped. Karoline opened her notebook, her fingers steady as she turned to a page marked with a single red tab. She read aloud, her voice steady and precise. "Section 7323 of the Hatch Act prohibits political activity on government property, but case law specifically, GSA v. Johnson, 1998, clarifies that personal platforms, like social media, fall outside its scope when used off-duty." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the gallery like a sudden frost. She looked up, her eyes meeting the judge's. "This law," she said, "was written before social media existed. My statement was on X, posted from my personal account, not a government platform." The simplicity of her argument was disarming, each word landing with the clarity of a bell. Kessler scoffed, his face reddening as he jumped to his feet. "You expect us to believe you're a legal expert?" "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "this is a press secretary playing lawyer," the gallery murmured, some nodding in agreement with Kessler, but others leaned forward, their skepticism wavering. The journalist in the green scarf scribbled furiously, her pen moving as if chasing a revelation. Karoline's eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, a silent acknowledgement of someone who was listening. The clerk's hands twitched, her neutral mask slipping as she glanced at the judge. Karoline's heart pounded, but her face remained calm, her resolve rooted in the years she'd spent proving herself in rooms like this. She thought of her father, who'd driven her to law school interviews in their old pickup truck, telling her that knowledge was her shield. You don't need their approval, he'd said. You need their respect. That notebook wasn't just notes. It was the culmination of sleepless nights, of arguments honed in Georgetown's law library, of a thesis that had earned her a rare commendation from Ellen Whitaker. The judge's smirk faded, his fingers tapping the bench as he processed her words. You're citing case law now, he said, his tone caught between surprise and irritation. I'll need to see that precedent. Karoline nodded, her voice unwavering. It's in my notes. Your Honor, I can provide the full citation. The room stirred, the murmurs growing louder as the gallery sensed a shift. Kessler's confidence faltered, his eyes darting to the judge as if seeking rescue. The journalist's pen flew across her notepad, her face alight with the realization that Karoline wasn't what she seemed. Who was this woman, really? The clerk stepped forward, almost instinctively, to retrieve a legal text from the bench, her movements betraying a flicker of curiosity. Karoline closed her notebook, her fingers lingering on the leather. She'd fired her first shot, and it had landed, but the battle wasn't over. The judge's expression was unreadable, his pen still tapping. Something was shifting, and he didn't like it. What would he do when he realized she was right? The Washington, D.C. courtroom was a sea of restless energy, its polished wood and high ceilings no longer imposing but charged with a shift in the air. Karoline Leavitt stood at the defendant's table, her worn leather notebook open, its pages a quiet testament to her resolve. Her navy blazer hung slightly loose on her frame, but her voice was steady, each word cutting through the room with the precision of a surgeon's blade. She just dismantled another of the prosecutor's arguments, citing a lesser-known precedent from a 2004 federal case that clarified the Hatch Act's limits on digital platforms. The law doesn't account for personal speech on social media, she said, her hazel eyes locked on Judge Harold Grayson. My post on X was made as a private citizen, not as a government official. The gallery, filled with reporters and onlookers, stirred, their murmurs growing louder as her words sank in. The journalist in the green scarf, seated in the third row, typed furiously on her phone, her posts on X spreading like wildfire across the platform. The young clerk with tightly braided hair, who'd stood silently near the judge's bench for hours, moved for the first time without prompting. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed Judge Grayson a copy of the Hatch Act, her eyes flickering toward Karoline with a mix of awe and hesitation. The judge took the document, his silver hair catching the light as he scanned it, his earlier smirk replaced by a furrowed brow. The prosecutor, Daniel Kessler, fumbled with his notes, his confidence unraveling. This is semantics, he said, his voice strained as he repeated a weaker version of his earlier argument. She's twisting the law to dodge responsibility. But the room wasn't with him anymore. A man in the gallery whispered to his neighbor, "She's right, isn't she?" Phones buzzed as more spectators pulled up Karoline's X post, rereading the single sentence about Canada's tax policy that had sparked this storm. The truth was starting to take root, and it was louder than Kessler's bluster. Karoline's heart pounded, but her face remained calm, her fingers resting lightly on the notebook. She thought of Professor Ellen Whitaker, her law school mentor, who'd pushed her to see the law not as a weapon but as a shield for what was right. "You'll face rooms that don't want you," Ellen had said, stand anyway. That memory anchored her now, keeping her steady as the gallery's whispers grew into a low hum. She'd spent years proving herself first in Georgetown's law library, then in the White House press room, where every question was a test. But this courtroom was different. Here, she wasn't just defending her name. She was defending the truth. The journalists' posts were gaining traction, with comments piling up, Leavitt schooling them. One read, "This is bigger than a tweet." Karoline didn't see the posts, but she felt the shift, like a breeze before a storm. Then, the courtroom doors opened with a soft creak, and a man in a tailored suit entered, his presence commanding attention. He was older, with graying temples and a calm authority that silenced the room. "Your Honor," he said, his voice measured. "I'm Richard Callahan, senior counsel from the White House legal office." He held a signed affidavit, its pages crisp and official. "Miss Leavitt's interpretation of the Hatch Act is correct. Her actions fall outside its jurisdiction." The room erupted, gasps and murmurs blending into a wave of sound. Callahan handed the affidavit to the clerk, who passed it to the judge with a look of quiet respect. Karoline's breath caught, not from surprise she'd known Callahan was coming, but from the weight of the moment. The gallery was alive now. Phones raised as spectators recorded the scene. The journalist's fingers flew across her screen. Her latest post reading, "Karoline Leavitt isn't just a press secretary. She clerked for Justice Alito." The judge's face paled, his fingers tightening on the affidavit as he read it. Kessler's mouth opened, then closed, his earlier bravado gone. The clerk stood a little straighter, her earlier neutrality replaced by a subtle nod toward Karoline. The gallery's energy was electric, the crowd sensing that this was no ordinary trial. Karoline wasn't just a young woman in over her head. She'd clerked for a Supreme Court justice, a fact buried in her resume but now shining like a beacon. Her notebook, with its careful notes and faded ink, was more than a relic. It was proof of her quiet brilliance. She thought of her father, who'd framed her law school diploma in their small-town living room, telling her she'd change the world one day, not by fighting, he'd said, but by being right. The room was hers now, but the fight wasn't over. The judge's eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was no smirk. This wasn't the end, but the tide had turned. What else did she have waiting in that notebook? The Washington, D.C. courtroom pulsed with a restless energy, its high ceilings and polished wood panels amplifying every sound: the creak of a bench, the rustle of papers, the low hum of whispered conversations. Karoline Leavitt stood at the defendant's table, her worn leather notebook now closed, its frayed edges a silent witness to the battle unfolding. Her navy blazer hung loosely on her frame, but her posture was unyielding, her hazel eyes bright with a fire that hadn't been there at the trial's start. The gallery, packed with reporters, lawyers, and onlookers, was a sea of shifting faces, some skeptical, others captivated. The journalist in the green scarf, seated in the third row, typed furiously on her phone, her live thread on X now trending nationwide with thousands of shares. The young clerk with tightly braided hair stood near the judge's bench, her earlier neutrality gone, replaced by a subtle nod of respect toward Karoline. The prosecutor, Daniel Kessler, was unraveling, his voice faltering as he tried to pivot from Karoline's devastating arguments. Kessler stammered, his notes slipping from his hands as he addressed Judge Harold Grayson. "Your Honor, this is a distraction," he said, his tone desperate. "Miss Leavitt is cherry-picking precedents to confuse the court." But his words lacked the earlier bite, and the gallery wasn't listening. Karoline's last move had been a masterstroke. She'd presented a printed timeline of her ex-posts, each one meticulously worded to avoid Hatch Act violations, and handed it to the clerk, who passed it to the judge with a look of quiet conviction. "I spoke as a citizen, not an official," Karoline had said, her voice steady but piercing, each syllable carrying the weight of truth. The timeline was damning dates, times, and screenshots showing her posts were made from her personal account, off government hours. With no trace of official White House branding, the gallery erupted in murmurs. A few spectators clapping before the judge's gavel silenced them. Karoline's heart raced, but her face remained calm, her hands resting lightly on the table. She thought of her father, who'd spent his life teaching history in a small Virginia town, telling her that justice was a quiet force, stronger than any shout. "You don't need to win their hearts," he'd said, "just their minds." That lesson guided her now, keeping her steady as the room's energy shifted. The journalist's posts on X were a wildfire, with comments flooding in Leavitt's not backing down. One read, "She's rewriting the rule book." Karoline didn't see the posts, but she felt their echo in the gallery's restless hum. The clerk's nod had been small but significant, a sign that even the silent were choosing sides. The truth was no longer a whisper, it was a bell ringing through the room, clear and undeniable. Judge Grayson's face was a mask of unease, his silver hair glinting as he studied the timeline. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped frown. "This requires review," he said. His voice clipped as he called for a recess. The gavel struck, and the room buzzed as spectators stood, some pulling out phones to record the moment. Kessler slumped in his chair, his confidence shattered, his eyes darting to the gallery as if searching for an ally. Karoline sat, her notebook closed, her breath slow and even. She thought of Professor Ellen Whitaker, her law school mentor, who'd taught her to face power with precision, not anger. "The law is your voice," Ellen had said. "Use it when it matters most." This was that moment, and Karoline had chosen to speak not for herself, but for the principle that no one should be punished for speaking freely. The journalist in the green scarf leaned forward, her eyes locked on Karoline as she typed another update. "Karoline Leavitt just turned the tables. The Hatch Act isn't what we thought." The clerk moved to organize papers on the bench, her movements deliberate, her glance toward Karoline carrying a quiet respect. The gallery was alive, some spectators whispering about her Supreme Court clerkship, others debating the law itself. Karoline's mind drifted to her law school days, to the nights she'd spent poring over cases in Georgetown's library, driven by a belief that the law could protect the truth. She'd faced doubters, then professors who questioned her youth, classmates who envied her ambition. Now, in this courtroom, those doubts were crumbling. The truth didn't need to shout, it was loud enough. But the recess wasn't a victory. Not yet. The judge's unease was palpable, his fingers tapping the bench as he left the room. Kessler's desperation hinted at a man who knew he'd lost the room but not the fight. Karoline's eyes lingered on the notebook, its pages filled with Ellen's handwritten notes, a gift from a mentor who'd seen her potential when others hadn't. She'd chosen to stand, to risk her career for a principle. But the cost was still unclear. The gallery's murmurs followed her, a mix of admiration and disbelief. The journalist's thread was shaping the narrative outside these walls. But inside, the judge held the gavel. Could he admit he'd been wrong? Or would he double down? Karoline's fire burned brighter. But the storm wasn't over. What would happen when the court reconvened? The Washington D.C. courtroom was a study in stillness as Judge Harold Grayson returned from the recess, his silver hair catching the dim light of the October afternoon filtering through high windows. The gallery, packed with reporters, lawyers, and onlookers, held its collective breath, the earlier buzz of murmurs replaced by an expectant hush. Karoline Leavitt sat at the defendant's table, her worn leather notebook closed, its frayed edges a quiet symbol of the journey she'd endured. Her navy blazer was slightly creased, but her posture was steady, her hazel eyes fixed on the judge with a calm that belied the storm she'd weathered. The journalist in the green scarf, seated in the third row, clutched her phone. Her latest post on X still trending with thousands of shares. The young clerk with tightly braided hair stood near the bench, her hands clasped. Her earlier neutrality now a quiet allegiance to Karoline's cause. The prosecutor, Daniel Kessler, sat slumped, his notes scattered, his earlier bravado reduced to a flicker of unease. Judge Grayson cleared his throat, his voice quieter than before, stripped of its earlier sarcasm. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his eyes meeting hers briefly before dropping to the papers before him. "After reviewing the evidence and relevant case law, this court finds no violation of the Hatch Act." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the room. The gallery gasped, a collective exhale of disbelief and relief. Karoline's breath caught, and a single tear slipped down her cheek, glistening in the courtroom's harsh light. It wasn't weakness, it was the release of a weight she'd carried since the trial began. Richard Callahan, the senior attorney from the White House counsel's office, placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low and warm. "You did it, Karoline," he whispered, his eyes crinkling with pride. The clerk's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. Her hands relaxing for the first time all day. The gallery erupted into whispers, phones buzzing as spectators shared the verdict on X. The journalist in the green scarf stood, weaving through the crowd to approach Karoline, her notepad tucked under her arm. "This is bigger than you," she said, her voice soft but earnest, showing Karoline her phone. The screen glowed with posts praising her courage, comments flooding in from strangers across the country. She stood up for free speech. One read, "Leavitt's a hero." Karoline's throat tightened, not from pride but from the realization that her fight had touched lives beyond these walls. She thought of her father, who'd framed her law school diploma in their Virginia living room, telling her that truth was worth any battle. "You're not just fighting for you," he'd said. "You're fighting for everyone who's been silenced." That memory wrapped around her now, a quiet comfort against the courtroom's cold formality. Kessler shifted in his seat, his face pale as he muttered a half-hearted apology. "I may have overstated the case," he said, his voice barely audible, his eyes avoiding Karoline's. The judge waved a hand, dismissing the remark with a tired sigh. "Enough, Mr. Kessler," he said, his tone weary but firm. The gallery's murmurs grew louder, some spectators shaking their heads at Kessler's retreat. Karoline's notebook lay on the table, its pages filled with the notes of Professor Ellen Whitaker, her mentor, who taught her that the law was a tool for justice, not a weapon for ego. Ellen's handwriting, faded but clear, had guided her through this trial, a reminder that she wasn't alone. Karoline's tear wasn't for victory. It was for the years of doubt she'd overcome, the rooms that had dismissed her, the voices that had called her too young, too inexperienced, too small to matter. The journalist lingered, her green scarf a splash of color in the courtroom's muted tones. "You've started something," she said, her eyes bright with conviction. "People are talking about the Hatch Act now, about what it means in the digital age." Karoline nodded, her voice caught in her throat. She hadn't come to gloat or to tear anyone down. She'd come to protect the truth, to prove that a single voice, armed with reason, could shift the tide. The clerk stepped forward to collect the timeline Karoline had submitted, her fingers brushing the paper with a reverence that hadn't been there before. The gallery was alive, some spectators clapping softly, others typing furiously on their phones. The verdict was spreading, a spark that could ignite change beyond this room. Karoline's heart ached, not with pain but with the weight of what she'd done not for herself, but for the principle that no one should be punished for speaking freely. Callahan leaned closer, his voice a steady anchor. "You didn't just win a case," he said. "You showed them who you are." Caroline's eyes drifted to the notebook, its leather worn from years of carrying her dreams. She thought of Ellen, who'd passed away before seeing her student rise to this moment, and of her father, who'd be watching the news tonight, his quiet pride brighter than any spotlight. The gallery's energy was a living thing, a chorus of voices that carried her name beyond the courtroom. But one question lingered, soft and persistent, like a whisper in the silence. Would this victory change anything beyond today? Would it reshape the way people saw the law? Or would it fade like so many headlines? Caroline's tear dried on her cheek, and her gaze settled on the judge, who looked smaller now, his gavel resting unused. The truth had spoken, but its echo was still unfolding. The Washington, D.C. courthouse loomed behind Karoline Leavitt as she stepped onto its marble steps, the late October sun casting long shadows across the pavement. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves, and the city hummed with its usual rhythm, honking taxis, distant sirens, the murmur of pedestrians. Caroline's navy blazer was slightly wrinkled, her worn leather notebook tucked into her bag, its frayed edges a quiet reminder of the battle she'd just fought. Reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing and microphones thrusting forward, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus. "Miss Leavitt, what's next?" one shouted. "Are you suing for defamation?" another pressed. Karoline paused, her hazel eyes scanning the crowd, her face calm but tired. "The law needs to evolve with the times," she said, her voice soft but clear, each word chosen with care. The reporters scribbled, their frenzy slowing as her words sank in. A simple statement that carried the weight of the day's victory. She moved through the crowd, her steps steady, her bag slung over one shoulder. The journalist in the green scarf stood at the edge of the group, her notepad closed, her eyes meeting Caroline's with a quiet nod of respect. Karoline returned the gesture, a fleeting connection that needed no words. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, notifications piling up from X, where her words were already sparking debates. Legal scholars posted threads analyzing the Hatch Act's outdated framework, while ordinary users shared stories of their own moments of being dismissed, silenced, or doubted. Karoline Leavitt just proved you don't need a loud voice to win. One post read, shared thousands of times. Karoline didn't check her phone, she didn't need to. The echo of the courtroom was enough, its energy still pulsing through her, a mix of relief and something deeper, something like peace. Inside her bag, the notebook pressed against her side, its pages filled with the handwritten notes of Professor Ellen Whitaker, her law school mentor who'd passed away 2 years earlier. Ellen had given her the notebook after her thesis defense, a quiet moment in a Georgetown classroom where she'd said, "You'll carry the law further than I ever could." Caroline's throat tightened at the memory, her fingers brushing the bag's strap as if to touch the notebook through the fabric. She thought of her father, who'd be watching the evening news in their small Virginia town, his pride a steady light across the miles. "You don't need their applause," he'd told her once, sitting in their old pickup truck after a mock trial win. "You need their respect." That respect was hers now, earned not through anger but through the quiet power of truth. The courthouse doors opened behind her, and the young clerk with tightly braided hair stepped out, her coat draped over one arm. She hesitated, then approached Karoline, her voice low. "I just wanted to say, you were incredible in there," she said, her eyes bright with sincerity. "I've never seen anyone stand up like that." Karoline smiled, the first real smile of the day, her heart lifting at the clerk's words. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "It means more than you know." The clerk nodded, then turned back to the courthouse, her steps lighter, as if she'd carried a piece of Karoline's courage with her. The reporters had dispersed, chasing their deadlines, but the journalist lingered. Typing one final post, Karoline Leavitt didn't just win a case. She showed us what justice looks like in the digital age. Karoline walked down the steps, the city unfolding before her, its monuments, its history, its endless motion. She thought of the judge, who'd issued a rare statement that morning, acknowledging the need for clarity in laws governing digital speech. It wasn't an apology, but it was a crack in the armor of tradition, a sign that her fight had left a mark. Daniel Kessler, the prosecutor, had quietly withdrawn from the case, his name absent from the news cycle, his earlier bravado reduced to a footnote. Karoline felt no satisfaction in his retreat. She hadn't come to tear anyone down. She'd come to lift something up, to prove that the law could bend toward justice if someone dared to push it. Her victory wasn't just hers. It was for the clerk, who'd found her voice in a quiet moment. It was for the journalist, whose words were reshaping the conversation. It was for anyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong, that their voice didn't matter. Karoline's steps slowed as she reached the sidewalk, the sun dipping lower, painting the sky in shades of gold and gray. She thought of Ellen's last letter, tucked into the notebook's back pocket, its words a guiding star. The law is only as strong as the people who carry it. Karoline had carried it today, not with shouts or grand gestures, but with the steady resolve of someone who believed in something bigger than herself. The debates on X continued, with calls for Hatch Act reforms gaining traction, legal scholars citing her case as a turning point. But Karoline didn't need the headlines to feel the change. It was in the clerk's smile, in the journalist's nod, in the weight of her notebook against her side. She didn't shout to be heard. She didn't need to. Truth doesn't whisper. It's loud when someone dares to say it. As she walked into the city's fading light, a question lingered, soft and open, like the horizon ahead. What else could she change now that she'd found her voice? Karoline's notebook rested in her bag, its worn leather catching the last light of the sun. She walked away, not triumphant, but steady, leaving a courtroom forever changed. Justice didn't roar, it settled like dust after a storm. Could one voice, soft but sure, shift the world's weight? Sometimes, the loudest truths are the ones spoken quietly, carried not by anger but by the courage to stand for what's right.